I'm now joined by Vanessa da Silva Faria from Ulrich Roux Associates. Good evening, Vanessa. Thanks very much for joining us. Just first, the importance of the presidency agreeing not to oppose any future court ruling on this matter.
Well, I think it's quite important, and it shows us what their intention actually is pertaining to whether or not the state should proceed or continue in paying Zuma's legal fees.
And what is it?
Well, you know, the fact that they have now decided that they're not going to oppose the application, they will just simply conform to the court order, is a good thing. It shows us that they're willing to do what the court thinks is the right thing to do, and they're not going to have an issue in that. And that's a good thing for us, because it shows that, you know, obviously once the court deals with the matter, they'll consider the crucial aspects of the agreement, of the State Attorneys Act, and everything pertaining to this issue in great detail. And the fact that the current presidency is willing to accept it and conform to it shows us that, you know, his intention is to do the right thing and to stand by any court order that is made.
What impression would they have given had they decided to oppose?
Well, they would obviously give the impression that they strongly believe that Zuma would be entitled to receiving payment for his legal fees. And, you know, that in itself is very arguable and can be argued at great lengths at courts. So, you know, we'll have to see what they're actually wanting. But again, I think the mere fact that they from the outset have now said that they're refusing to, or they are not going to oppose it, is a very good thing for us.
But, I mean, an examination, let's say, just a lawyer looking at what is said to have been an agreement that has been in place, signed by a former president, that they would pay all the legal costs that he incurred in a criminal prosecution. What is you as lawyers reading of that? Does it sound legal? Does it sound proper? Or should it, or was it supposed to have conditionalities? What is your reading of it?
Well, to be honest with you, it's extremely interesting. And I think that there's going to be a very big issue in law that will be dealt with at court. The agreement itself is based on the State Attorneys Act, particularly Section 3, which allows the state attorney, or which allows the state to pay for any legal fees pertaining to legal proceedings that a government official has incurred through his acting or through his capacity as a government official. So in that regard, the agreement could be argued to be a valid and enforceable agreement. The issue now, though, is that that agreement pertains only to the criminal charges and the criminal proceedings that Zuma is faced with. And at this point in time, he's no longer you know, protected by the State Attorneys Act, and he's no longer a government official. So the interesting thing here is whether or not the State Attorneys Act will act in a retrospective manner, whether the Act gives protection to a person who used to be a government official, who committed these offences while he was a government official and maybe in his capacity as a government official, but now whether he's still entitled to that protection and to that security now that he is no longer any government official. So that in itself is a very interesting topic that the court will have to consider and will have to make a ruling on. At this point in time, there isn't any specific legislation or case law that has actually considered that specific issue.
Now, we've had lawyers in the recent cases, most of them involving the president, former president, of course, saying or making arguments like, oh, well, our constitution, when it was written, it didn't envisage people like the former president. It assumed that we'll always have presidents like former President Nelson Mandela and so on. Now, what could the state law advisors, well, I mean, the law applicable here, have envisaged? In other words, why was it so lax about that? Why was that not foreseen? Because presidents, do come and go. Or was there a deliberateness about it being left, all too loose?
Well, I think one must also consider the actual circumstances that Jacob Zuma find himself. I don't think anyone could necessarily
have anticipate
the numerous legal proceedings and how voluminous it is. And I mean, I think that is actually a very crucial point to it. But I don't think it was anything done deliberately to spite anyone. And I mean, if they're going to bring the Constitution into it, no one is saying that he's not entitled to legal representation. As a general, normal public member, he is entitled to legal representation. He must either pay for it himself or he can apply for legal aid. But I mean, again, that looks into his personal circumstances as an average member, like any other person who'd be facing the issues that he's facing would have to deal with.
But I mean, like judges, he too, president, gets paid till he dies. So he can pay out of his own pocket, cannot he?
Exactly, and you know, personally, I don't see why he can't be expected to do so. And you know, what's important is that part of the agreement was that he had to give an undertaking that if he was, at the end of all the proceedings, found to have committed these offences in his personal capacity, he was in any event expected to pay the state back. Now, on that basis, if you've given that undertaking, you know, you need to make sure that you are able to do that if it does so happen. So I don't see why at this point in time, when he's technically, you know, not a government official, he needs to now fend for himself.
So there was a safeguard after all. Well,
there was essentially, but that again is in terms of the legislation that dealt with it. And it's all based on the Treasury regulations, which were then applicable when the agreement was entered into. And that's sort of a legislation that they couldn't have just simply bypassed and forgotten about. So there was a safety net for him. But I mean, again, at this point in time, the question was, when he entered into the agreement, he was, you know, a government official protected by the State Attorneys Act. Now he no longer is. Is that agreement still enforceable towards a person who's now just a general member of the public? And that is exactly something that the court needs to look at.
Of course. Well, political fundies, analysts and other people are, of course, attaching a different meaning to this set of circumstances and what it is exactly that the presidency is doing here by saying it will not oppose any future court ruling on the state's provision of legal fees to President Jacob Zuma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much
for joining us this evening.